After a fight, my wife yelled, "You're a cheapskate! We're done!" I stood in the middle of the ballroom, everyone staring at me. The old blind pianist told me, "Act like you're my grandson. My driver is coming. Your wife is going to regret leaving you for the richest woman in the ballroom. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Fred, and at 58 years old, I thought I knew what humiliation felt like. I was wrong. The Crystal Ballroom at the Grand View Hotel was everything Susan had dreamed of for our anniversary celebration. 25 years of marriage deserved something special, she said. The chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory silk, and the polished marble floor reflected the elegant crowd mingling beneath ornate ceiling moldings. Everyone looked like they belonged there except me. I stood near the bar, tugging at my rented tuxedo jacket that felt too tight across my shoulders. The fabric was stiff and unfamiliar, nothing like the comfortable flannel shirts I wore to my job at the hardware store. Susan had insisted I rent something appropriate for the occasion, though she'd made it clear my budget constraints meant we couldn't afford to buy. "Another ginger ale, sir?" The bartender's voice was polite but distant. I nodded, watching as he poured the golden liquid into a crystal glass that probably cost more than I made in a day. Around me, conversations flowed about vacation homes in the Hamptons, investment portfolios, and business deals worth millions. I felt like an imposter at my own anniversary dinner. Susan appeared at my elbow, her red dress hugging curves that still took my breath away after all these years. But her expression was tight with barely contained frustration. "Fred, you've been standing here for 20 minutes, she hissed, her voice low enough that nearby guests couldn't hear. "Mrs. Whitmore wants to meet you, and you're hiding behind the bar like some kind of wallflower." Eleanor Whitmore. I'd heard that name whispered reverently throughout the evening. The woman who owned half the commercial real estate in town, whose charity galas made the society pages, whose opinion could make or break social standing. Susan had been trying to get an introduction all evening. "I'm not hiding," I said quietly. "I just don't have much to say to these people." Susan's perfectly applied lipstick couldn't hide the thin line her mouth had become. "That's exactly the problem, Fred. You never try. You just stand there in your discount clothes with your cheap drinks, acting like you're too good for everyone else." The words stung because there was truth in them. I did feel out of place here, surrounded by wealth I couldn't comprehend, let alone compete with. But I wasn't acting superior. I was trying to be invisible. "Susan, please. Can we just enjoy our dinner? You look beautiful tonight, and I thought this was supposed to be about us." She let out a sharp laugh that made several heads turn in our direction. "About us." Fred, look around. This is about being somebody, about making connections, about not being embarrassed to introduce my husband to people who matter. The conversation at nearby tables had quieted, and I could feel eyes on us. My face burned with the familiar heat of embarrassment, the same feeling I'd carried since childhood when other kids had nicer clothes and bigger lunches than I did. "I work hard," I said, my voice barely audible. "I've provided for you for 25 years. Maybe I'm not rich, but I've never let you down." "Provided." Susan's voice rose another notch. "Fred, we live in a 2-bedroom ranch house that we're still paying off. I drive a car that's 8 years old, and you think taking me to Olive Garden twice a month is fine dining. Meanwhile, Eleanor Whitmore just told me about her winter home in Aspen, and I had to pretend we had vacation plans more exciting than camping in state parks." Each word landed like a physical blow. I'd been proud of our little house, proud that we'd never missed a mortgage payment despite my modest income. I thought the camping trips were romantic, a chance to reconnect away from the pressures of daily life. Apparently, I'd been wrong about a lot of things. "What do you want me to do, Susan? I can't change what I am. I'm not a businessman or an investor. I fix things. I help people with their repairs and their problems, and I'm good at what I do." "Good at what you do?" Her voice cracked like a whip. "Fred, you're a clerk at a hardware store. You've been a clerk for 15 years. You have no ambition, no drive to be anything more than ordinary." The ballroom had gone silent around us. Even the string quartet seemed to pause between songs. I could see Eleanor Whitmore watching us from her table, her silver hair perfectly styled, her diamond earrings catching the light as she leaned forward to hear better. "Susan, please." Not here. But something had broken loose in my wife. 25 years of resentment pouring out like water from a burst dam. Not here? When, Fred? When is the right time to talk about how you've never wanted anything more than mediocrity? When is the right time to discuss how embarrassed I am to tell people what my husband does for a living? Tears welled in my eyes and I hated myself for it. Real men weren't supposed to cry, especially not in front of a room full of strangers who already looked down on them. I love you, I whispered, as if those 3 words could somehow repair what was breaking between us. Susan stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something die in her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was cold and final. You're a cheapskate, Fred. You've always been a cheapskate, and you always will be. I can't do this anymore. We're done. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to my destruction. I watched her approach Eleanor Whitmore's table, watched the elegant older woman stand and embrace my wife like she was welcoming her into some exclusive club I'd never be invited to join. I stood there in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by whispers and barely concealed stares. Some faces showed pity, others amusement, but most just looked uncomfortable, as if my public humiliation was a social disease they might catch. My hands shook as I set down my ginger ale on a nearby table. The crystal made a small ringing sound against the marble top, absurdly delicate in the heavy silence that surrounded me. Then I heard it. The gentle sound of piano keys, a soft melody that seemed to acknowledge my pain without judgment. I turned toward the corner of the ballroom where an old man sat at a baby grand piano, his fingers moving across the keys with practiced grace. He was thin and frail-looking, probably in his 80s, with silver hair and dark glasses that suggested he was blind. As I watched, he turned his head slightly in my direction, as if he could sense my presence despite his blindness. Then he did something that surprised me. He smiled. It wasn't a pitying smile or a mocking one. It was knowing, almost conspiratorial, as if we shared some secret that nobody else in the room understood. The pianist's fingers never stopped moving, but his voice carried across the ballroom's acoustics with surprising clarity. "Young man," he said, though his tone suggested he knew I wasn't that young anymore, "would you mind helping an old musician with something?" I walked toward the piano, grateful for any excuse to escape the staring eyes and whispered conversations that followed my public humiliation. The old pianist's fingers continued their gentle melody, something classical that I couldn't name but that seemed to settle the knots in my stomach. "Yes, sir," I said, stopping beside the gleaming black piano. "What can I help you with?" The old man's smile widened and he gestured to the empty space beside the piano bench. "Please sit with me for a moment. My name is Harold Pemberton, and I've been playing piano in this ballroom for more years than I care to count." I glanced back toward Susan, who was now seated at Eleanor Whitmore's table, animated in conversation with a group of well-dressed women who hung on her every word. She hadn't looked in my direction once since walking away. "Fred Morrison," I said, settling onto the edge of the bench beside Harold. "I appreciate the distraction, but I should probably leave soon." Harold's fingers transitioned into a different melody, something softer and more melancholy. "Should you? Or are you simply running away from something that might change your life forever?" The words sent a chill down my spine. There was something in Harold's tone that suggested he knew more about my situation than a stranger should. "I'm sorry, but how could you possibly know anything about my life? We've never met before tonight." Harold chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "Oh, but we have met, Fred. Not directly, perhaps, but our paths have crossed in ways you couldn't possibly imagine." I studied his profile, the sharp nose and high cheekbones, the way his silver hair was perfectly combed despite his obvious age. His dark glasses reflected the ballroom's chandeliers, making it impossible to see his eyes, but I had the unsettling feeling that he could see me perfectly well. "I'm afraid I don't understand. Tell me, Fred, do you remember your father speaking about his time in Korea, specifically about a fellow soldier named Tommy Pemberton?" My breath caught in my throat. My father had died when I was 17, but I remembered his war stories. Tommy Pemberton had been his best friend in the service, the man who'd saved Dad's life during an ambush near Seoul. Dad had talked about Tommy with a mixture of love and sadness, mentioning how they'd lost touch after the war, despite promises to stay in contact. Tommy Pemberton was my nephew. Harold said quietly, his fingers never missing a note. He wrote to me about your father many times. Robert Morrison, Bobby to his friends. A good man who deserved better than what life handed him. I felt dizzy, as if the ballroom was spinning around me. That's impossible. You couldn't know that. Bobby worked construction his whole life, broke his back to provide for his family. Tommy told me about the letters your father sent after the war, about how he married a sweet girl named Martha, had a son named Fred who was born in 1965. Each detail hit like a physical blow. My mother's name was Martha. I was born in 1965. But this information wasn't exactly secret. Anyone could have researched it. What are you trying to tell me? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer would change everything. Harold's playing shifted again, becoming more complex, more urgent. I'm trying to tell you that your father saved my nephew's life, and Tommy never forgot that debt. Before he died 3 years ago, he made me promise to find Bobby Morrison's son and make sure he knew the truth about his family's history. What truth? The truth that your father was too proud and too stubborn to claim what was rightfully his. The truth that you've been living like a poor man when you're anything but poor. My heart hammered against my ribs. Around us, the ballroom continued its elegant dance, but I felt like I was trapped in some surreal nightmare where nothing made sense. I don't understand what you're saying. Harold turned toward me slightly, and I caught a glimpse of keen intelligence behind his dark glasses. Your father owned property, Fred. Lots of property. He bought land in the 1960s when it was cheap, thinking he was making smart investments for his family's future. But when he died suddenly of that heart attack, the paperwork was scattered, the deeds were filed in different counties, and your mother was too grief-stricken to sort through it all. My mother never mentioned any property, because she didn't know about most of it. Your father kept his investments private, thinking he'd have time to organize everything properly before he passed. He was only 47 when he died, Fred. He thought he had decades left to build something for his family. I thought about my childhood after Dad's death. Mom struggling to keep up with bills, working 2 jobs just to maintain our small house, the way she'd aged 10 years in the span of 1. If there had been property, surely she would have known. Even if that were true, it would be too late now. It's been 41 years since Dad died. Harold's smile became mysterious, almost mischievous. Not necessarily. You see, when property taxes aren't paid for extended periods, the state takes over. But there are legal mechanisms for rightful heirs to reclaim inherited property, especially when the original owner's death left affairs in disarray. My mouth went dry. Are you saying there's still property out there with my father's name on it? I'm saying there's property that should have your name on it now. Tommy spent the last 5 years of his life researching your father's investments, tracking down deeds, following paper trails that led to some very interesting discoveries. What kind of discoveries? Before Harold could answer, I heard the sharp click of heels approaching. Susan appeared beside the piano, her face flushed with excitement or alcohol, I couldn't tell which. Fred, what are you doing? She demanded. I've been trying to introduce you to important people, and you're hiding in the corner with a piano player? Harold's fingers never stopped moving across the keys, but his voice carried clearly. Mrs. Morrison, how lovely to finally meet you. I've heard so much about you. Susan blinked, clearly taken aback. I'm sorry, have we met? Not formally, but I've been watching you this evening. You seem to have made quite an impression on Eleanor Whitmore. Something flickered across Susan's face, a mixture of pride and wariness. Mrs. Whitmore has been very kind. She's taken an interest in my future. I'm sure she has, Harold said, and there was something almost predatory in his tone. Eleanor has always been excellent at recognizing opportunity. A sound from outside caught Harold's attention, the low rumble of an expensive engine pulling into the hotel's circular drive. His playing stopped abruptly, the sudden silence startling in its completeness. Ah, he said, rising from the piano bench with surprising agility for his age. My ride has arrived? I stood as well, confused and desperate for answers to the dozens of questions racing through my mind. Wait, you can't just leave. What about my father's property? What about these discoveries you mentioned? Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an elegant business card, pressing it into my palm. All in good time, Fred, but first I need you to do something for me. What? When my driver comes inside to collect me, I want you to act like you're my grandson. Play along with whatever I say, and don't ask questions until we're in the car." "I don't understand." Harold's grip on my arm was surprisingly strong. "Trust me, Fred. In about 2 minutes, everything you thought you knew about your life is going to change, and your wife—" He glanced toward Susan, who was still standing there looking confused and slightly annoyed. "Your wife is going to realize she made a terrible mistake tonight." The ballroom doors opened, and a man in a crisp black suit entered, scanning the room with professional efficiency. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of bearing that suggested military or security training. When his eyes found Harold, he nodded and began walking toward us. "Remember," Harold whispered urgently, "you're my grandson. Follow my lead." Susan stepped closer to me, her confusion deepening. "Fred, what is going on? Who is this man?" The driver approached our group, his expression respectful but unreadable. "Mr. Pemberton, sir. The car is ready whenever you are." Harold smiled broadly, reaching out to pat my shoulder with grandfatherly affection. "Thank you, James. I was just telling my grandson Fred here about the evening's entertainment. Weren't you enjoying the music, grandson?" The word hit the air like a thunderclap. Susan's mouth fell open, and I could see Eleanor Whitmore turning in her chair at her table, suddenly paying very close attention to our corner of the ballroom. "Yes," I heard myself say, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "It was beautiful, grandfather." Harold beamed as if I'd just given him the greatest gift in the world. "Wonderful. James, would you mind if Fred joined us for the ride home? I have so much I want to share with him about the family." The Bentleys that waited outside the Grandview Hotel was not what I expected. The midnight blue sedan gleamed under the hotel's entrance lights, its chrome details catching reflections like jewelry. James held the rear door open with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to serving wealthy clients, and I found myself sliding across leather seats that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Harold settled beside me with a satisfied sigh, tapping his fingers against his knee as James closed the door and moved around to the driver's seat. Through the tinted windows, I could see Susan standing in the hotel's entrance, her face a mixture of confusion and something that looked suspiciously like panic. "Don't look back, Fred," Harold said quietly as the car pulled away from the curb. "Tonight is about moving forward." The interior of the Bentley was like stepping into another world. Soft ambient lighting, polished wood trim, and the kind of silence that only comes with serious money. I ran my hand along the leather seat, trying to process what had just happened. "I need you to explain what's going on," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you want me to pretend to be your grandson? And what did you mean about my father's property?" Harold turned toward me, and in the car's dim lighting I could see him more clearly than I had in the ballroom. His face was lined with age, but there was a sharpness to his features that spoke of intelligence and determination. Behind his dark glasses, I caught a glimpse of eyes that seemed far too knowing for comfort. "Your father, Robert Morrison, was my nephew Tommy's best friend and the man who saved his life in Korea. When Tommy came home from the war, he couldn't stop talking about Bobby Morrison. How brave he was, how loyal, how he deserved so much more than the hand life had dealt him. I thought about the few photos I had of my father in his military uniform, young and serious-faced, standing with other soldiers whose names I'd never known. Tommy Pemberton had been just another name in Dad's war stories, but apparently the connection had run much deeper than I'd realized. Tommy made a promise to your father," Harold continued. "If anything ever happened to Bobby, Tommy would look after his family. When your father died so young, Tommy tried to find you and your mother, but you'd moved and there was no forwarding address. It took him years to track down where you'd gone." "My mother moved us to Michigan after Dad died," I said. "She thought a fresh start would help with the grief." "Exactly. And by the time Tommy found you, you were 18 and had already enlisted in the army yourself. Tommy decided to wait, to let you live your own life. But he never stopped watching from a distance. He never stopped researching what your father had left behind." The car glided through the city streets, past neighborhoods I recognized and others that were clearly beyond my social circle. Massive houses with circular drives and manicured lawns, the kind of wealth I'd only seen in magazines. "You mentioned property," I said. "What kind of property?" Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents. Your father was smarter than anyone gave him credit for, Fred. While other men his age were spending their paychecks on beer and cars, Bobby was buying land, small parcels, mostly rural, in counties where property was cheap and no one thought it would ever be worth anything. He opened the folder, and even in the car's dim light, I could see photocopied deeds, survey maps, and official-looking documents with my father's signature scrawled across the bottom. 1962 through 1968, Harold said, pointing to dates on various papers. Your father bought 11 separate parcels of land across 3 counties. He paid between $500 and $2,000 per parcel, depending on the size and location. That doesn't sound like much money. Harold's smile was enigmatic. It wasn't much money then, Fred. But land has a funny way of appreciating in value, especially when suburban sprawl starts reaching into rural areas. My heart began to race as the implications sank in. Are you saying this land is worth more now? I'm saying that 3 of your father's parcels are now located in what became the Millbrook Shopping Center. 2 others are part of the Riverside Industrial Park. And the remaining 6 parcels sit directly in the path of the new interstate bypass that's scheduled to break ground next year. The folder trembled in my hands as I stared at the documents. Shopping centers, industrial parks, interstate highways. These were the kinds of developments that turned worthless farmland into gold mines. How much? I whispered. Conservatively, based on recent comparable sales and development projections, we're looking at somewhere between $8 and $12 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. $8 to $12 million. I thought about my 2-bedroom ranch house with its mortgage that still had 15 years left on it. I thought about my 8-year-old car and my job at the hardware store where I made $37,000 a year. I thought about Susan calling me a cheapskate in front of a room full of strangers. That's impossible, I said. If my father owned all this land, where has it been for 41 years? Why haven't I been paying property taxes? Why didn't my mother know about it? Because your father was planning to tell her everything when he turned 50, Harold said gently. He wanted to surprise her, to present her with financial security she'd never dreamed of. But he died at 47, and the paperwork was scattered across multiple filing systems in different counties. Your mother was grieving and overwhelmed, and the legal system wasn't as interconnected then as it is now. What happened to the property? The counties eventually took possession for unpaid taxes, but here's where it gets interesting. Because your father's death was sudden and his affairs were in disarray, the properties were never properly processed through probate court. They're in a legal limbo, technically owned by the state, but with unclear title history. My head was spinning. What does that mean? It means that with proper legal representation, a direct heir can petition for restoration of ownership, especially when the original owner's death prevented normal estate processing. Tommy spent years researching the legal precedents, and he found dozens of cases where inherited property was successfully reclaimed decades after the original owner's death. I stared out the window, watching expensive neighborhoods give way to even more expensive ones. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my family's history, about my own worth, was crumbling and rebuilding itself with each word. Harold spoke. Why didn't Tommy contact me directly? Why work through you? Harold's expression grew sad. Because Tommy died 3 years ago, Fred. Cancer. But before he passed, he made me promise to find you and make sure you knew the truth. He felt he owed it to your father's memory. I still don't understand why you wanted me to pretend to be your grandson back at the hotel. Because, my dear boy, your wife isn't the only one who's been watching you tonight. Eleanor Whitmore has been taking a very keen interest in your conversation with Susan. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? Harold leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Eleanor Whitmore has made a fortune over the years by befriending struggling wives, offering them advice about divorce settlements, and then purchasing their husbands' assets at below-market prices during forced sales. She's done it dozens of times. You're saying she's deliberately trying to break up marriages? I'm saying she's very good at recognizing when marriages are already breaking apart, and she's excellent at positioning herself to profit from the aftermath. Your wife's very public outburst tonight was exactly the kind of opportunity Eleanor looks for. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text message from Susan. Where are you? People are asking questions. Eleanor wants to know about the old man you were talking to. Harold noticed me reading the message. She's curious now, isn't she? Wondering who I am, why my driver picked you up in a Bentley, why I claimed you as my grandson. Why did you do that? Because I wanted Eleanor to see you differently. I wanted her to wonder if maybe she'd misjudged the situation. I wanted your wife to start asking questions about what she might not know about her husband. But I'm not your grandson. I'm still just Fred Morrison, who works at a hardware store and can barely afford the mortgage on a modest house. Harold patted my shoulder with grandfatherly affection. Not for much longer, my boy. Tomorrow morning we're going to pay a visit to the law offices of Pemberton, Walsh and Associates. My nephew Tommy may be gone, but his law firm is still very much in business, and they've been waiting 3 years to meet Robert Morrison's son. The car began to slow, and I realized we were pulling into the circular drive of a mansion that looked like something out of a movie. Tall white columns, perfectly manicured grounds, and enough windows to suggest rooms I couldn't even imagine. "This is your house?" I asked, awestruck. Harold chuckled. "One of them. When you've been playing piano in hotel ballrooms for 60 years and investing wisely, you accumulate a few comfortable places to live. You're not just a hotel pianist." "Oh, but I am, Fred. I've played piano in that ballroom every Friday and Saturday night for 6 decades. It's amazing what you can learn about people when they think you're just part of the furniture. It's amazing what kinds of conversations happen around a blind old piano player who seems harmless and invisible." The car stopped and James appeared to open our door. As I stepped out onto the pristine driveway, Harold placed a firm hand on my arm. "Tomorrow, Fred, you're going to discover that everything you thought you knew about your life was wrong. But tonight I want you to call your wife and tell her you'll be staying with your grandfather Harold for the evening. She'll never believe that story." Harold's smile was perfectly wicked. "Trust me, my boy. After tonight, your wife is going to believe whatever explanation makes her feel less foolish for walking away from a multimillionaire." I woke up in a bedroom larger than my entire living room at home, surrounded by mahogany furniture that probably cost more than my annual salary. The morning light filtered through silk curtains, casting everything in a golden glow that made the previous evening feel like some impossible dream. But the manila folder on the bedside table proved it had all been real. 11 property deeds with my father's name, survey maps showing parcels of land worth millions, and legal documents that could change my life forever. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. "Mr. Morrison?" It was James, Harold's driver, though this morning he was dressed more casually in a polo shirt and slacks. "Mr. Pemberton asked me to let you know breakfast is ready and your attorney will be here at 10 o'clock. "My attorney?" The words sent a thrill of disbelief through me. 24 hours ago I couldn't have afforded to consult a lawyer about a parking ticket. I dressed in the same clothes from the night before and made my way downstairs, following the sound of classical music and the aroma of coffee. Harold's house was even more impressive in daylight, with oil paintings lining the hallways and enough antique furniture to stock a museum. I found Harold in a sun-drenched breakfast room, reading a newspaper while nibbling on what looked like eggs Benedict prepared by a professional chef. "Ah, Fred," he said, looking up with a warm smile. "I trust you slept well. Maria prepared breakfast, and I took the liberty of having James retrieve some fresh clothes for you from Nordstrom. They're hanging in your room. You bought me clothes? Consider it an investment in your future image," Harold said with a wink. "When you meet with the attorneys this morning, I want you looking like a man who belongs in their offices, not like someone who needs their charity." I sat down across from him, still struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening. "Harold, I need to ask you something, and I want a completely honest answer." "Of course." "Is this real? The property, the money, the possibility that I'm actually wealthy, or is this some elaborate joke?" Harold set down his newspaper and removed his dark glasses, revealing sharp blue eyes that seemed far too perceptive for someone who claimed to be blind. "You can see," I said, startled. "Legally blind, not completely blind," he corrected. "I can make out shapes, shadows, general movements. But yes, I can see well enough to read large print and navigate familiar spaces. The dark glasses are partly practical and partly theatrical. People tend to speak more freely around someone they perceive as harmless. That still doesn't answer my question about whether this is real. Harold reached across the table and picked up the manila folder, opening it to a specific page. This is a certified copy of a deed filed in Riverside County on September 15, 1964. Your father purchased 47 acres of farmland for $800. That same property now sits underneath the Riverside Industrial Park, where monthly lease payments total approximately $73,000. He flipped to another page. This is a property assessment from Montgomery County showing 18 acres purchased by Robert Morrison in 1966 for $1,200. The county is currently negotiating with developers who want to build a shopping complex on that land. Conservative estimates place its current value at $2.8 million. Document after document, each one more staggering than the last. My father hadn't just bought random patches of land. He'd somehow managed to identify areas that would become incredibly valuable decades later. How did he know? I whispered. Your father was a construction worker, Fred. He knew which areas were slated for future development because he worked on the projects that would eventually connect rural areas to expanding suburbs. He understood infrastructure in ways that most investors didn't. My phone buzzed with a text message. Susan. Fred, where are you? I'm worried. Please call me. Harold noticed me reading the message. She's starting to wonder if she made a mistake last night. What am I supposed to tell her? Nothing for now. Let her wonder, let her ask questions, let her realize that maybe she doesn't know her husband as well as she thought she did. At exactly 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang and James escorted two men in expensive suits into Harold's study. The first was tall and silver-haired with the kind of confidence that comes from winning high-stakes legal battles. The second was younger but equally well-dressed, carrying a briefcase that looked like it could hold state secrets. Fred Morrison, Harold said, rising from behind an enormous mahogany desk. I'd like you to meet Jonathan Walsh and David Pemberton. They've been handling your family's legal affairs for the past 3 years. David Pemberton extended his hand with a warm smile. Mr. Morrison, it's an honor to finally meet you. My father, Tommy Pemberton, spoke of you and your father often. I'm sorry we couldn't connect under happier circumstances. Tommy's son, I said, shaking his hand. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. Dad would be thrilled to know we finally tracked you down. Jonathan Walsh opened his briefcase and spread documents across Harold's desk. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to be direct with you because time is somewhat of the essence here. Your father owned significant property that has been in legal limbo for over 40 years. Under normal circumstances, reclaiming inherited property after such a long period would be nearly impossible. My heart sank. But your case has several unique factors that work in your favor. First, your father's death was sudden and prevented normal probate proceedings. Second, the properties were scattered across multiple counties with poor communication between filing systems. Third, and most importantly, recent changes in state law regarding abandoned property have created new opportunities for legitimate heirs to reclaim assets. David spread out a map showing the various properties highlighted in different colors. We've spent 3 years researching not just the legal aspects, but also the current status and value of each parcel. 5 of the properties are currently generating income through commercial leases. 3 are undeveloped, but located in high-growth areas. And 3 are positioned to become extremely valuable when the new interstate construction begins next year. What's the total value? Jonathan and David exchanged glances. Conservative estimate, assuming current market conditions and planned development projects, we're looking at approximately $11.7 million. The number hit me like lightning. $11.7 million. I thought about my conversation with Susan the night before. Her humiliation about our modest lifestyle, her embarrassment at not having vacation homes or luxury cars. What do I need to do to claim this property? We file a series of petitions with the appropriate courts, Jonathan explained. Given the unusual circumstances and the length of time involved, we expect some resistance from the counties involved. They've been collecting revenue from these properties for decades and they won't want to give them up easily. How long will the process take? If everything goes smoothly, 6 to 8 months. If the counties decide to fight, it could take 2 years or more. And how much will this cost? David smiled. Dad left specific instructions about that. He established a legal fund to cover all costs associated with reclaiming your father's property. You won't pay a penny unless and until we successfully restore your ownership. I stared at the documents spread across the desk, each one representing a piece of my father's dreams for his family's future. Dreams that had been buried with him but were now rising from the dead like something out of a fairy tale. There's one more thing, Harold said from behind the desk. Something we need to discuss before you make any decisions about how to proceed. What's that? Your wife's conversation with Eleanor Whitmore last night didn't end when you left the ballroom. They talked for another 2 hours, and Eleanor has made Susan a very interesting proposition. My blood ran cold. What kind of proposition? Jonathan cleared his throat. Eleanor Whitmore has offered to provide Mrs. Morrison with legal representation in a divorce proceeding, along with financial backing to ensure she receives the maximum possible settlement. She wants to help Susan divorce me? She wants to help Susan divorce a man she believes is worth very little, so she can then purchase any assets at below-market prices during the settlement process. Harold clarified. It's a strategy she's used many times before. David leaned forward. The problem is, if Mrs. Morrison files for divorce before we complete the property restoration process, any assets we recover could become part of the marital estate. She could potentially claim half of everything. Half of $11.7 million, I said slowly. Exactly. Which means we need to move quickly and quietly. If Eleanor Whitmore discovers what we're doing, she'll advise your wife to file for divorce immediately and then fight to delay our property claims until after the divorce settlement is finalized. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Susan. Fred, I know you're angry, but we need to talk. Eleanor thinks I should consider my options. Harold read the message over my shoulder. She's already taking Eleanor's advice. The question is, Fred, are you ready to fight for what's rightfully yours? I looked around the room at these men who had spent years working to restore my family's legacy, who had tracked me down and offered to give me back a fortune I never knew existed. I thought about my father, working construction jobs and buying land with the hope of creating a better life for his family. What do I need to sign? The documents were signed, the legal machinery was in motion, and I was officially the plaintiff in 11 separate property restoration cases that could make me a multimillionaire. But as I sat in Harold's study, surrounded by evidence of my father's hidden legacy, all I could think about was the woman I'd been married to for 25 years. We need to discuss your wife's situation more thoroughly, Jonathan Walsh said, settling back into his leather chair. Eleanor Whitmore isn't just offering Susan legal advice, she's making a strategic investment. David Pemberton pulled out another file, this one marked with Susan's name. We've done some preliminary research on Mrs. Morrison's activities over the past few months. The pattern suggests this divorce isn't as spontaneous as it appeared last night. My stomach lurched. What do you mean? Your wife has been meeting with Eleanor Whitmore for approximately 6 weeks, David said, opening the file to reveal photographs, restaurant receipts, and what looked like phone records. They've had lunch together 8 times, and Mrs. Morrison has visited Eleanor's office on 3 separate occasions. How do you know all this? Harold leaned forward from behind his desk. When you've spent 60 years observing wealthy people in social settings, you develop certain resources. Eleanor Whitmore's activities are of interest to many people in this city, and not all of them are friendly toward her business practices. Jonathan spread out copies of what appeared to be legal documents. 3 weeks ago, your wife consulted with a divorce attorney. She didn't file any papers, but she did request a preliminary assessment of what she might expect from a divorce settlement. The words felt like physical blows. She's been planning to leave me for weeks? It appears so, and Eleanor Whitmore has been coaching her through the process, likely in exchange for first rights to purchase any assets that come up for sale during the divorce proceedings. I thought back over the past few weeks, searching for signs I might have missed. Susan had been distant, distracted, spending more time on her phone than usual. I'd attributed it to stress from planning our anniversary dinner, but apparently she'd been planning something entirely different. There's more, David said gently. Your wife has also been researching your employment history, your financial records, and your family background. She's been building a case for why she deserves a larger settlement based on the sacrifices she claims to have made during your marriage. What kind of sacrifices? Harold pulled out a stack of what looked like printed emails. According to these communications between Susan and Eleanor, your wife believes she's entitled to compensation for 25 years of supporting a husband with no ambition, no drive to succeed, and no prospects for financial improvement. Each word was like a knife twisting in my chest. I'd spent our entire marriage believing that Susan loved me despite my modest circumstances, that she valued our simple life together, that she was content with what we'd built as a team. She's been documenting everything, Jonathan continued. Your salary history, your spending habits, even photographs of your house and car to demonstrate what she calls the lifestyle limitations imposed by your husband's lack of professional growth. I picked up one of the printed emails, reading Susan's words in black and white. Fred has never shown any ambition beyond his current position. I've spent 25 years encouraging him to pursue better opportunities, but he seems content with mediocrity. I deserve better than a life limited by his unwillingness to grow. Another email. Eleanor thinks I could get substantial alimony based on the years I've invested in a marriage that has provided no financial security. She says I'm still young enough to start over with someone who can give me the life I deserve. And another. I'm tired of being embarrassed by my husband's job, his clothes, his complete lack of social sophistication. Eleanor introduced me to her circle, and I finally understand what I've been missing. I set the papers down with shaking hands. How long have you known about this? We discovered the connection between Susan and Eleanor 3 days ago, Harold said. It's one of the reasons we decided to approach you when we did. If Susan had filed for divorce before we found you, recovering your father's property would have become infinitely more complicated. So everything last night, the public humiliation, calling me a cheapskate, that was all planned? We believe Eleanor coached her to create a public scene that would justify her decision to leave you, David said. Witnesses to your wife's dissatisfaction would support her claims in divorce court. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. Not just the planned divorce, but the calculated cruelty of it all. Susan hadn't just fallen out of love with me. She'd systematically built a case against our entire marriage while pretending everything was normal. My phone buzzed with another text. Fred, please come home. I'm scared and confused. Last night got out of hand. We need to talk about our future. I showed the message to Harold, who smiled grimly. She's having second thoughts. The fact that you left with a wealthy man in a Bentley has her questioning whether she knows the whole story. What should I do? Go home, Jonathan advised. Act normally. Don't mention the property. Don't mention what you've learned about her meetings with Eleanor. Let her dig her own grave deeper. I don't know if I can pretend everything is okay. Harold stood and walked around the desk, placing a fatherly hand on my shoulder. Fred, your wife has spent weeks documenting what she sees as your failures. She's prepared to humiliate you in court, to claim that you've wasted her life and that she deserves compensation for her suffering. The question is, are you going to let her get away with it? What are my alternatives? David pulled out a fresh set of documents. We could file a countersuit alleging fraud and emotional distress. If we can prove she entered into a conspiracy with Eleanor Whitmore to manipulate the divorce proceedings for financial gain, we could potentially recover damages. Or, Jonathan added, we could let her file for divorce and then surprise her with the property revelations. She'd be entitled to half of whatever we recover, but she'd also be tied to a legal process that could take years to resolve. Eleanor Whitmore would lose interest once she realizes there are millions of dollars at stake and serious legal complications. I thought about the woman I'd loved for 25 years, the woman who'd shared my bed and my dreams and my modest life, the woman who'd apparently been documenting my inadequacies while planning her escape. There's a third option, Harold said, quietly. We could give Susan exactly what she thinks she wants. I don't understand. Your wife believes you're worth very little. She's preparing to divorce a man she sees as a failure, someone who will never amount to anything significant. Eleanor Whitmore is interested in Susan because she thinks you're easy prey. Harold walked to his window, looking out at the manicured grounds of his estate. What if we let them proceed with their plans? What if we let Susan file for divorce, split your current assets according to her expectations, and then proceed with the property recovery after the divorce is finalized? She'd get half the house and half my savings account, which isn't much, I said slowly. Exactly. A few $1,000s in savings, half the equity in a modest house, maybe some alimony based on your current salary. Eleanor would purchase any assets at below-market prices. Susan would walk away with what she considers adequate compensation for her suffering, and then I'd be free to claim my father's property without having to share it with someone who betrayed me. Jonathan nodded approvingly. It's risky because divorce proceedings can be unpredictable, but if we time everything correctly, your wife could end up with a settlement based on assets worth maybe $50,000 instead of half of $11.7 million. But I'd have to let her divorce me. I'd have to let her think she's winning. Fred, Harold said, turning back from the window, your wife stopped being your partner the moment she started documenting your failures for Eleanor Whitmore. She stopped being your ally when she began planning your humiliation in divorce court. The question isn't whether you should let her divorce you. The question is whether you want justice or just revenge. I stood up and walked to the window beside Harold, looking out at a world that had changed completely in the space of 24 hours. Somewhere out there, Susan was waiting for me to come home so she could continue her performance as a confused and wounded wife. Somewhere out there, Eleanor Whitmore was planning how to profit from my destruction. What's the difference between justice and revenge? I asked. Harold smiled, and for the first time since I'd met him, the expression was genuinely warm instead of calculated. Justice is getting what you deserve. Revenge is making sure they get what they deserve. I pulled out my phone and typed a response to Susan. I'll be home soon. We definitely need to talk about our future. As I hit send, I realized that my wife had no idea how right she was. We definitely needed to talk about our future, just not in the way she expected. Gentlemen, I said, turning back to the lawyers, let's discuss timing. 6 months later, I stood in the law offices of Pemberton, Walsh and Associates, holding the final court order that officially restored ownership of all 11 properties to the Morrison estate. The legal battles had been intense, with 3 different counties fighting the restoration, but Jonathan and David had prevailed in every case. The divorce had been finalized 2 weeks earlier. Susan received exactly what she'd expected. $22,000 from our savings account, half the equity in our modest house, and monthly alimony payments based on my hardware store salary. Eleanor Whitmore had purchased the house at below market value, just as Harold had predicted, and Susan had walked away feeling vindicated and financially secure. She had no idea that the man she divorced for being a failure was now worth $12.3 million. The Riverside Industrial Park lease payments alone will generate approximately $78,000 monthly, David said, reviewing the final paperwork. The Montgomery County properties are scheduled for development starting next spring, which should increase their value substantially. And the interstate project has been approved, which means the remaining parcels will likely triple in value over the next 5 years. I nodded, but the numbers still felt surreal. A year ago, I'd been counting pennies to afford a dinner at Olive Garden. Now I was earning more in a month than I'd previously made in 2 years. What about the tax implications? I asked. Jonathan smiled. The property restoration is treated as an inheritance rather than income. So there's no immediate tax liability. Once we start selling parcels or collecting lease payments, we'll structure everything through a family trust to minimize your tax burden. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and couldn't help but smile. Good news, Harold asked from across the conference table. Susan just sent me a photo of her new apartment. She's very excited about her independence and her fresh start. Harold chuckled. I imagine she is. Eleanor Whitmore's circle must be very impressed with her successful divorce settlement. The irony was perfect. Susan believed she'd escaped a life of limitation and mediocrity. She told anyone who would listen about how she'd finally found the courage to leave her unmotivated husband and claim the life she deserved. Eleanor had introduced her to other divorced women who'd successfully upgraded their circumstances, and Susan felt like she'd joined an exclusive club. "Have you decided what you want to do with the Morrison Trust?" David asked. "I'd established the trust not just for tax purposes, but because I wanted my father's legacy to mean something beyond just accumulating wealth. I want to create a scholarship fund for children of construction workers and tradespeople, kids whose parents work with their hands but dream of giving their children opportunities for higher education." "That's a beautiful tribute to your father," Harold said. "And I want to endow a music program for underprivileged kids. Piano lessons, specifically." Harold's eyes brightened, behind his dark glasses. "Any particular reason for piano lessons?" "Because I met a piano player who taught me that sometimes the most important people in your life are the ones you least expect to matter." We spent the next hour finalizing details, signing papers, and setting up the financial structures that would manage my new wealth. When everything was complete, Jonathan and David shook my hand and congratulated me on successfully reclaiming my father's legacy. As they left, Harold and I remained in the conference room, surrounded by the paperwork that had transformed my life. "What will you do now?" Harold asked. "I bought a house," I said. "Nothing too extravagant, but it has a beautiful view of the lake and enough space for a workshop where I can build furniture. I'm going to keep working at the hardware store for now, at least until I decide what I really want to do with the rest of my life. And Susan?" I pulled out my phone and showed Harold a series of recent social media posts. Susan at elegant restaurants, Susan at charity galas, Susan wearing expensive dresses and jewelry that she'd obviously purchased with her divorce settlement and alimony payments. "She's living the life she always wanted," I said. "She's dating a businessman who drives a Mercedes and takes her to country club events. She posts constantly about how happy she is to finally be with someone who appreciates her worth. Do you miss her?" The question surprised me with its directness. I thought about it carefully, examining my feelings with the honesty that the past year had taught me. "I miss the woman I thought she was," I said finally. "I miss the marriage I believed we had. But the real Susan, the woman who documented my failures and planned my humiliation. No, I don't miss her at all." Harold nodded approvingly. "Grief is appropriate, Fred. You lost something real when you discovered the truth about your wife. But don't confuse grief for what was lost with regret for what you've gained." My phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from my new neighbor, a widow named Margaret, who'd brought me homemade cookies when I moved in, and who'd somehow convinced me to join her book club despite my protests that I wasn't much of a reader. "Dinner tonight?" her text read. "I'm making pot roast and it's too much for one person." I typed back, "I'd love to. Can I bring dessert?" Her response came immediately. "Only if you promise not to buy it from the expensive bakery. I saw those shopping bags from Whole Foods. You're getting too fancy for this neighborhood." I laughed out loud. Margaret had no idea about my financial situation. To her, I was just Fred, the divorced guy who worked at the hardware store and was learning to live alone for the first time in 25 years. She liked me for exactly who I appeared to be, which was somehow both humbling and liberating. "New friend?" Harold asked. "Maybe more than a friend eventually. She's kind and genuine and completely unimpressed by wealth or status. She volunteers at the animal shelter and grows her own vegetables and thinks the most exotic vacation destination is the state park 2 hours north of here. She sounds perfect for you." The funny thing is, Susan would have hated her, would have considered her small-minded and unambitious. But Margaret is the most content person I've ever met. She's happy with her life, grateful for what she has, and interested in people for who they are rather than what they can provide. Harold stood and walked to the conference room window, looking down at the city street where expensive cars navigated between pedestrians hurrying to important appointments. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "Susan got exactly what she wanted. She's free from what she considered a limiting marriage. She has enough money to maintain her lifestyle for several years, and she's connected to a social circle that validates her choices. Are you suggesting I should feel sorry for her? Not at all. I'm suggesting that sometimes the best revenge is simply allowing people to get exactly what they think they want." I joined him at the window, watching the city bustle below us. Somewhere out there, Susan was probably getting ready for another elegant evening with her new boyfriend, probably posting photos of her outfit and her dinner reservations, probably feeling victorious about the life she'd created for herself. She had no idea that the man she divorced for being a cheapskate was now worth more money than she'd ever dreamed of. She had no idea that the property recovery she'd never known about could have given her a lifestyle beyond her wildest fantasies. She had no idea that her former husband was now in a position to buy and sell people like Eleanor Whitmore without thinking twice about it. The beautiful thing about justice, Harold said, is that it doesn't require the guilty parties to understand what's happening to them. Susan will live her entire life believing she made the right choice, believing she escaped a limiting situation and found something better. She'll never know what she lost. And Eleanor Whitmore? Harold's smile was enigmatic. Eleanor made her profit from your house sale, but she's also now tied to a woman whose financial security is entirely dependent on alimony payments from a hardware store clerk. Susan isn't the wealthy conquest Eleanor thought she was acquiring. She's just another divorced woman with limited assets and expensive tastes. I thought about the last time I'd seen Eleanor, at a restaurant downtown where I'd taken Margaret for her birthday. Eleanor had been dining with Susan and another couple, and Susan had spotted me across the restaurant. She'd waved enthusiastically, probably wanting to show off her new lifestyle to her ex-husband, but I'd simply nodded politely and returned my attention to Margaret's story about a rescue dog she was trying to find a home for. Eleanor had studied me for a long moment, clearly trying to reconcile my presence at an upscale restaurant with her assessment of my financial situation. But since I was dressed in simple khakis and a button-down shirt, driving my modest car and dining with a woman who wore a sweater she'd obviously knitted herself, Eleanor had apparently concluded that I was simply stretching my budget for a special occasion. "I have one more surprise for you," Harold said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "Consider it a housewarming gift." I opened the envelope to find a deed to a small piece of property about an hour north of the city. According to the paperwork, it was 17 acres of wooded land with a small cabin and a pond. "Harold, I can't accept this." "It's not valuable in terms of development potential," he said. "Just a quiet place where a man can think, where he can remember his father without distractions, where he can decide what kind of legacy he wants to leave for the next generation." I stared at the deed, overwhelmed by the generosity of this man who'd become so much more than the stranger who'd rescued me from my humiliation. "Thank you," I said. "For everything. Not just the property, but for giving me back my father's dreams. For teaching me the difference between justice and revenge. For showing me that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what you're really worth." Harold clapped me on the shoulder with genuine affection. "Your father would be proud of you, Fred. You took everything that life threw at you, and you turned it into something beautiful." As we left the law office together, I felt a peace I'd never experienced before. I had more money than I'd ever dreamed of, but more importantly, I had something Susan had never been able to take away from me. Self-respect. My phone buzzed one more time. Margaret again. "Change of plans. My granddaughter just called, and she's bringing her new boyfriend to dinner. Hope you don't mind a full house. Fair warning, she'll probably interrogate you about your intentions with her grandmother." I typed back, "Looking forward to it. I'll bring enough dessert for everyone." As I walked to my car, I realized that Margaret's granddaughter's boyfriend would be meeting the real Fred Morrison tonight. Not the failure Susan had described to her divorce attorney, not the cheapskate she'd humiliated in a ballroom, not the limited man who'd held her back from the life she deserved. He'd be meeting a man who'd learned to value himself, who'd discovered that true wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with dignity, kindness, and the courage to build a life based on authenticity rather than pretense. And that man, I realized, was worth far more than $12.3 million.